a new podcast format from the Public Safety Foundation, Safety Matters. No shortage of material for us to cover. I mean, probably the last year since probably our last podcast together, kind of just insanity upon insanity, perhaps. Any highlights for you?
Well, where does one start? Yeah, it's been quite some time since I sort of wrapped up the Protect and Serve podcast after sort of exploring the lives of many crime fighters, not only across the UK, but touching on some of the global efforts of some of the bravest men and women on the front line. And yeah, the craziness of UK policing continues on. It's the only thing that seems to be the most consistent at the moment is how crazy it can all become. I suppose the biggest highlights for me is the challenges that continue seem to face London as the epicenter and as sort of ultimately the compass of policing in terms of sort of the challenges around NX121 and the shooting of Chris Carber, a known gangster in London. The misconduct hearing, which is up and coming for that poor chap. The constant sort of, the challenges facing policing around recruitment and retention. The numbers are vastly concerning as to people departing from UK policing. And if I'm honest with you, there's been no real sort of understanding or sort of clarification or even sort of idea of how successful the Met's New for London plan is. So lots to talk about over the coming episodes. But as you say, we're not short of any material to talk about, that's for sure.
No, for sure. And obviously we had Operation Coffee Break, which was a great initiative. Pat on the back to everyone who sort of gave us the support on that and shared it and donated and contributed. So we look forward to obviously sharing the next stage of delivery. But I suppose obviously the thing it would be we just couldn't not kick off this week with is obviously this case out of Dorset Police with PC Lorne Castle. I mean, essentially, there but for the grace of God goes any copper, as far as I can gather.
I sit back every day and wonder how any frontline cop in any way, shape or form can be robustly enthusiastic about fighting crime in the 21st century. In 2025, the statement's been made very clear. If you find a young scallywag armed with a knife who shows any level of resistance, and you even get slightly caught up in the moment in ensuring that that young individual knows who is in charge and ultimately that there is ramifications to their actions. If a complaint is to become forthcoming, or even if one of your colleagues, senior or otherwise, seems to disagree with the sort of level of response, you can find yourself in the crosshairs of a very senior officer at a panel who'll seem to deem that your position is no longer tenable. So absolutely sort of quite surprised at the fallout over the last couple of weeks, but equally quite humbled to see the level of support by the great British public.
Right. And I mean, I think at the time of recording, I think it's well north of £40,000 raised, and with every bit of good fortune, it'll smash through the next target. So, yeah, and I mean, I watched the clip, and again, it's a novelty for us in the UK to have even an extract of body-worn video released in the aftermath of something like this. Obviously, it's a selective edit. They've not given us the whole backstory, which I think is a real shame on the part of the force, and obviously the Police and Crime Commissioner, I think, as well, would have done well to have pushed for greater transparency. Likewise, we've not even had the hearing report either, which again really ought to have been out at the same time to help inform any discussion, any debate. But just, fundamentally for me, watching it, I thought, that's that sort of call to, some sort of youth kicking off, causing problems, probably with a knife in their pocket or waistband, ten a penny kind of job that any copper worth their salt will have had to have dealt with at some point. And I mean, for me watching it, is there always an opportunity to learn from some of these things? Of course. I suspect Lorne himself, if he hadn't been dragged through the sort of absolute madness that he has been, I'm sure he would acknowledge maybe that, if I was doing it again, I might do this a bit different, or I might do that a bit different, but nothing kind of fundamentally sort of problematic from my perspective. And certainly thinking back to, my time, if an officer brought that to me, if one of Lorne's colleagues had brought that case to me and said, "Oh, Sarge or Governor or whatever, can you have a look at the body worn?" I was a bit, because we do have a lot of inexperienced officers. So if to the extent that that's any kind of component to this, for me, it would have been a learning point. It would have been an opportunity to debrief the job. Let's play the whole body worn video. Let's have Lorne talk through it. Let's get either a force, safety instructor along to kind of complement that. Let's talk about it. Let's learn from it. But instead, it seems as though he's basically, for whatever reason, the crosshairs got put on him, and he's now, dismissed.
I reflected over the past week of some of the sort of more powerful and resilient senior leaders of days gone by. I remember when Lord Hogan Howe was appointed as the Commissioner of the Met, one of the comments he made outside NSY when he was appointed and he was standing next to Theresa May is he wanted criminals to fear the police. He wanted them to know and understand that if police were out there and they were going to commit any acts of criminality, that they would be located, they would be found, and they would be dealt with robustly. Now, I'm not trying to say that gives officers carte blanche to behave in any manner they seem fit. There's a level of professionalism which is expected on frontline cops. And I think when you look at the amount of interactions they have with the public on a day-to-day basis and the level of complaints that come through, I think we could say in the whole that 95% of the time they act with great levels of professionalism and equally maintaining their cool and composure. But when you're dealing with a sort of serious and violent individual who's not complying with instructions, who is resisting arrest, that stuff is not the scripture of fairy tales. It never looks brilliant. Cops can get caught up in the moment. As an operational sergeant myself, and with 12 years in the police, there are times when you have to learn from these incidents, and people reflect on them and say, maybe I could have done that in a slightly different way. But these are really, really challenging incidents that we're asking these cops to deal with. We want crime fighters. We want them to feel they can deal with these people robustly. And ultimately, we want those that seek to do harm within our societies across the UK to understand that the police will deal with them firmly and robustly and won't take no for an answer if they need to take them into custody because of whatever they've alleged to have done. So, I'm really disappointed in the lack of sort of support from senior leaders to say, listen, yes, there are lessons to be learned here. But we seem to be moving further and further away from that, and really being on the side of those that wish to criticise even more.
Yeah, and I've wondered kind of what caused this to ever even reach a gross misconduct kind of sort of stage in proceedings. I mean, obviously there's some language that's used. I won't repeat it here, but there was some language used, some expletives used, some sort of slightly offensive maybe terms used. But again, from my experience of policing, sometimes you do have to verbally dominate the situation in order to avoid having to use, sort of more, injurious, shall we say, physical force. So for me, the language, even if someone listening to us sort of thinks, oh, well, I don't think police officers should swear, say. Well, no, ordinarily, police officers, there shouldn't be any need to swear. But as you say, when you're dealing with a sort of violent individual resisting, or people who you fear are about to offer up much greater resistance, then I think it's more than reasonable to deliver, a verbal sort of battering, if you will. So for me, I have wondered whether the language was the particular trigger. Was that the lack of respect? Was that the lack of courtesy? Because to me, as I said at the start of this, I suppose they're there, but for the grace of God, kind of. You find yourself in a stairwell dealing with three people and you're only expected to be up against one. I can tell you for a fact that, I used expletives to get control of the situation. And honestly, people would have said, oh, you lacked courtesy, you lacked respect. Yes, damn right I did, because I needed to get control of it. So the language piece, I sort of am a bit puzzled as to how that even sort of really registers. And then to the extent that there's any sort of strikes delivered by the officer seemingly in the video, or whether there's any kind of protracted sort of, oh, well, I would have stopped at this point, or he was under control. Well, again, he wasn't actually in cuffs until like right to the end. I don't even have to watch the video again, but from recollection, throughout that entire piece, the guy was resisting, the guy was not complying, and it took a while for those cuffs to get on. So for me, even that kind of argument doesn't hold water. So as I was saying, I really struggle to see how this could ever end up in a gross misconduct hearing, never mind even if it did, how do we end up at dismissal?
And I think that's the greatest challenge. We're trying to get into the minds of people that really, I don't believe, have got the thought of the welfare and the backing of their frontline operational men and women on the front line, really trying to process those decisions. Ultimately, you know, there's always a backstory. If this is an individual that is receiving complaint after complaint after complaint, and they've been sanctioned before, and there's no change in behaviour.
Right.
But when you've got a former temporary chief inspector coming out publicly and backing an individual who he knows over many, many years, the individual's received commendations, bravery awards, is clearly what would be described as a thief taker within the job.
Right.
You know, very good at what he does. Suddenly finds himself coming unstuck because he's dealing with a nefarious member of the public who sadly, some members of the public only understand one language because they don't have an array, you know, a great vocabulary, and sometimes swearing is the only way to get through to them.
Right.
And you know, I just don't think everything has been taken into account. And of course, there's context that we haven't seen, maybe. And yes, there may be things that could be done slightly better. There's always, we've mentioned, there's lessons to be learned. You know, when I read and looked at a witness statement from that incident, like one lady saying she even dialed 999 to see if they could get extra units to him because he looked like he was in a difficult spot. For me, that already demonstrates the guy is almost overwhelmed and dealing with a situation under immense amounts of pressure. And now we have this ridiculous decision being made, which quite frankly has come back on the force in an astronomically bad way. And hence now they've just dribble-fed a little bit of body worn to try and put themselves in a better position, which I think has left us asking more questions than answering any.
Yeah, agreed. It really has. And I think, you know, at a time where, you know, there's obviously allegations of two-tier policing, there's allegations of all sorts of issues with the quality of policing provided in the country. And as I say, you know, the last year and presumably the next year or two at least, we just have this drip of kind of stories that sort of cause and provoke some public outrage. And I think this is just another one. And I think this one I think maybe what makes this one different, because it feels different. It feels like this is a bit of a watershed moment. And I mean, I saw Lorne's interview with Nigel Farage on GB News, and you know, Lorne himself said, "I hope some good can come from this." Now, as I said in my Substack, which I encourage anyone to have a look at who hasn't, essentially, you know, he wants something good to come from this, but whether that is going to be in a timely fashion is a whole other question. And I think, you know, it would be remiss of me probably to just make the point that Dorset Police, as per my Substack, I mean, I think they're lost. I think they're all at sea up at HQ. You know, they've got scrutiny panels that are questioning officers' use of handcuffs when dealing with people who are found with weapons. I mean, you know, where does that even come from? What an absolute waste of time, money, energy, and resource. They have and they promote these kind of disproportionality statistics for use of force and stop and search and everything else. They're just complete junk. Complete junk. You know, honestly, if Dorset Police was a hospital and it was offering treatment, I wouldn't go anywhere near it. Honestly, Ollie, I would run a mile. I would find the quack. I'd find the local quack over relying on the Dorset Police NHS Trust equivalent. So for me, there's a real malaise. There's a real issue, and there's a real blind spot. I've spoken about this before, but there's a real blind spot for a lot of the chiefs who just, you know, they still probably over in Dorset HQ Ivory Towers, they probably still don't grasp why everyone's up in arms. They presumably think we're sort of, you know, out there. We're the dinosaurs who, you know, should have been taken out to pasture a long time ago.
I wonder whether, you know, but this isn't just localized to Dorset. There's one chief constable that I have any sense of confidence in at the moment. That's Steve Watson up at GMP. You know, he carries himself, he backs his troops, he's a crime-fighting chief, he expects high standards, he presents himself well. You know, whereas everywhere else I look amongst the UK, and I'm sure there's some other good chiefs I haven't mentioned in that small little... But, you know, what I will say is that I would struggle to find any of them that really understand where policing was built upon in terms of those Peelian principles. Policing without fear or favour. You know, one of the core... You know, we're so busy worrying about the flags that should be flying above our stations to appease certain members of the community. We're so worried about what the implications of stop and search are. We're now creating charters where we're allowing the public to dictate to us when searching gets carried out. We've become such a complaint-orientated society that now officers are fearing. If you look at stop and search in the Met alone, it's like plummeting off a cliff. like the confidence in policing, because the ramifications and the empowerment the public has been given to dictate how policing operates has got chiefs absolutely dead terrified, and as such, that is falling into sort of the culture of how officers are now behaving. They're doing the 8 or 12 hours, and they're going home. They're not looking to do any additional work. They're not looking to go and find find crooks like you and I did on housing estates. They don't want any of that. They want to do their 8 hours. They want to stand on a crime scene, sit in a hospital, and then go home to their families. They're not interested.
Yeah, and I mean, it's terrifying, really, because it's not even that policing is just marching to the public at large's tune, right? Like, if you were taking a sample of the entire public and then determining what you therefore police and how you therefore police, you probably wouldn't be too far off. No. It's the fact that the segment of the public, and to some extent their own workforces, that they seem completely completely in bed with. I won't pursue that analogy too far. I wouldn't want to get anyone in trouble, but essentially they're so kind of captured is the term that a lot of politicos would use. They see this as ideological capture, institutional capture, and so they have the round tables with the people who are upset about too much stop and search. But they won't have a round table with people who are upset about a lack of stop and search, right?
No.
They'll have a round table with people to talk about, I don't know, how to encourage, I don't know, transgender stop and searching of people in custody or something. But they won't have a round table with the people who say, well, hang on, actually, we think a man should search a man and we think a woman should search a woman. So it's this very selective, and that's where this whole two-tier piece, and again, some listeners may well go, Rory, stop with the two-tier, you're not doing yourself any favours and stuff. But the reality is that perception is out there. And sadly, I think it's more than just a perception. And I think you're right, Ollie, to say that this is about more than just Dorset. But I think Dorset has become now the lightning rod for this issue. I think perhaps the fact, and I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure the teenager wasn't from an ethnic minority. I mean, I don't think they've released any detail, but from the body-worn video, it didn't, to me, obviously look like an individual from an ethnic minority. And so perhaps that also has allowed this particular case to be feasted on, shall we say, a bit more heartily by people who are fed up of the way policing's gone, because that racial dimension isn't in this. It wasn't any of the allegations.
My biggest gripe here is the one accountability tool that really is left to exist within this whole thing is the Police and Crime Commissioner. Right. Where is he in all this? Where is he standing up and saying, "Listen, I want the public to feel safe and reassured that we have an effective crime fighting force down in Dorset." Nowhere to be seen. If anything, just dancing to the tune of everybody in terms of the way it was dealt with. But that PCC role is so significantly important in terms of accountability and setting the tone, in ensuring the chief is meeting the expectations of what the public wants. And I think in this instance, they've all got it completely wrong.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I mean, as you say, the Police and Crime Commissioner, David Sidgwick, I think put out two statements, one in the immediate aftermath-ish of the outcome, and then another to go with the body-worn video. And it was in pretty much lockstep with the Chief Constable. And, you sort of think to yourself, I mean, again, this is more with my, political kind of hat on. I mean, even if he is genuinely in lockstep, right? And one assumes he is because that's what he's said. Just from a political perspective, you sort of go, well, hang on. For me, watching that video, as I say, I can't see how it's fair to take someone's entire career away off the back of doing his job, essentially. And I'm happy. Others will maybe shoot me down, but was it a bit of an imperfect arrest? Yes. I mean, look, a lot of arrests are. That doesn't mean someone should be dismissed. And so for me, had I been, fortunate enough to be Police and Crime Commissioner down there, I'd have been like having some conversations ahead of that time with people to kind of understand the issue and also to create some space around it. I mean, I'd have been withholding judgment. Look, hopefully Lorne gets an opportunity to appeal. I mean, I don't even think a route to appeal is even clear at this point. No. So you've got to hope that there is one. And so I'd be keeping my powder dry on this one. This has got public outrage, former cop outrage, probably a lot of serving cop outrage around it. Keep your powder dry and take the win at the end of this, where you can actually go, I never in a million years am I ever going to allow this to happen ever again in my force. And to the extent that the chief officers have a falling out, well, ultimately, Police and Crime Commission, you've got the power to fire them. And there's enough lunacy going on with all the stuff I've talked about, all the stuff in the Substack, the absolute lack of critical thinking, the lack of common sense on use of force, on stop and search, on basic statistics. There's enough there to fire them.
My greatest fear at the moment is I actually don't think chiefs understand the challenges which are faced on the front line. I don't think they understand. They're certainly not blind to it, but it would be nice to see them come out on the road occasionally just to see some of the significant challenges and the actual level of violence that police are now facing. The level of discontent amongst the public and those that seek to do wrong. Nobody comes along willingly these days. We're seeing more and more cops driven at and run over. We've got an officer in Thames Valley in a critical condition at the moment. We've got NX121, car driven at him. We've got Thames Valley officer killed only a couple of years ago up here with a car with a bunch of gypsies. The violence that cops are facing here in the UK is unprecedented. And you only have to look across the water. And when you hear a chief like Grady Judge, like a strong crime-fighting leader who comes out and says it as it is, if you seek to do our officers harm, if you're going to do the wrong thing, you're going to face the full force of the law. And we just don't have that tone here. We just don't have any of it. We have this sort of appeasing sort of level of, we're going to listen to the community. Of course you're going to listen to them, but there's a point we have to say we're here for a reason. We are the deterrent and we are the shield between good and bad, that this is what we're here for. And it's a very thin blue line and it's getting thinner every day. And I think unless chiefs, and this is driven by the National Police Chiefs Council, unless they start changing their thinking and the dialogue around how they should be leading their organisations, this is only going to get worse. And I think, as you say, I think Dorset is certainly a moment that we're going to be reflecting on for some time in terms of sort of how officers are treated. It affects recruitment in terms of people wanting to join an organisation, which is not going to back them if they get involved. Because when I joined at 17, 18 years of age, I joined to get involved in that sort of stuff. You want to be locking up the bad guys. You want to be on the ground wrestling with them because that's the idea of policing. And at the moment, if we carry on the path we're going, it's going to be a very, very bleak future for frontline operational cops.
Well, yeah. And of course, in the background of all of this, we've obviously got the government's announcements around prison releases, changes to prison recall, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously that's a byproduct. Look, I'll be the first to admit that's a byproduct of successive governments for decades not building enough prison places. But the result now and into the next few years at least is going to be, they virtually want to abolish short prison sentences. So, where once upon a time you'd at least get, a few weeks, you might get a few weeks relief and the community might get a few weeks respite from that particular tearaway, that they soon won't have any respite. And likewise for the cops, subject to assault, subject to obstruction, resisting arrest, all of those things that the judiciary just don't take seriously in the first place, right? They see it as, oh, well, it's part of the job. And, oh, did he really hurt you? Come back when you got a broken jaw, mate. Historically, they might still at least on occasion have got a little stint in prison. That's gone. For the next year or 2, 3, 4, 5 years, short prison sentence is virtually gone. It's going to some extent, be open season on cops. And at a time where, in the wake of, whether it's the Croydon bus job, whether it's, NX121 for the firearms boys and girls, whether it's, PC Lorne Castle, former PC Lorne Castle now, this sort of tightrope, this ever thinner tightrope of walking where you're trying to do the job that the public expect you to do. You're trying to do it in a way that's true to yourself and your compass and your courage and morals and values, whilst also not finding yourself either in a prison cell for something that actually is bonkers, or indeed in this case being dismissed for something that's just totally mad. So I think that the territory ahead is particularly challenging, and I think the grim reality, the sort of realpolitik to it, is that frankly a lot of these chiefs, they're retiring, right? They've got their eye on the exit door. They're 5 years from now, they're getting their big, massive lump sum. They're off on the gold-plated pension. And of course there may be exceptions who still really do care and get it and are trying to do the right things within the constraints they face. But the perception amongst, I'd argue, a large portion of the public and probably a large portion of the cops too, is they don't get it. They don't. When was the last time the Assistant Chief Constable on the panel for Lorne Castle? When did she make her last arrest of a violent subject?
Oh well, Good luck with
Assistant
that
Chief Constable, so probably 15, 20 years in the making. So we've got to go back like 20 odd years. We're talking probably 2005.
one. Yeah.
Imagine the last time you might have actually dealt with a violent resisting subject, 2005. That's pre-camera phone, pre-smartphone, pre-social media, kind of this witch hunt sort of environment. And ever since perhaps then, it's been, offices, carpeted floors, 9 to 5s, slightly, I might be being unfair to her, and I'm sure people will let me know if I am, but there's a real problem here. There's a real problem. And that feedback loop at the moment just doesn't exist.
I've lost count how many times both you and I have appeared, whether it be on LBC, on GB News, Talk TV, etc., to talk about this departure away from using prisons as an effective tool, as a deterrent to people committing crime. Now, the amount of stories you see of people committing some of the most horrific crimes in society, child sex offences, people possessing indecent images of children on an astronomical level. None of these people are seeing the inside of a prison cell at all. And these are offences against the most vulnerable in society. It's just not happening.
Yeah.
You think to yourself, if we're departing away from using prisons because we failed to invest in the appropriate way, as you say, over a number of different governments, over a number of years, we are truly in a very, very difficult period. And as I think Sir Mark Rowley openly admitted, this angle that we're taking, this softer look on releasing early, is going to impact policing significantly. And he arguably wants to know where the funding is going to come from to plug the holes to be able to manage these issues.
Right.
So it's a real issue for with forces already struggling to balance the books, having funding pulled from under their feet, with prisons now releasing people far earlier than they should have been, and some people not even touching a prison cell. Who on earth is going to be managing these on top of already the growing challenges on policing across the country? It really is a significant issue, which I think is being underplayed.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, next week we'll have the spending review for anyone not sort of aware of what that entails. That's basically the Treasury, the Chancellor will come forth with the sort of spending review, the spending sort of budget allocations for all the different government departments for the coming years. And, just to give some context, obviously Sir Mark Rowley, among others, obviously lobbying through the papers and other channels to try and get more cash. Ultimately policing largely comes out of the Home Office budget. And of course, the other big element in the Home Office budget is obviously immigration and asylum.
Yeah.
And, so in essence, and, again, the more politically correct may want to mute the video, but every time you see someone coming across that channel illegally, they are taking money from policing. I mean, it's as simple as that. Because up in HM Treasury, when they're deciding how much to give the Home Office, then they're not looking at policing and crime separately. They're going in aggregate. What do we want to give the Home Office? That's the reality of it. That's the reality. It shouldn't be that way, but that is the reality. And so, in essence, until there's a grip of the immigration, the border crisis, until there's a proper grip of that, policing is going to be lucky to get a look in. And of course, if you give any money, this is the other thing that will be going on, and people might not appreciate this, but what will also be going on in Treasury is, well, if we give the cops any money, that means they're going to catch some crooks occasionally. So that means more court cases. That means more prosecutions. That means we need more prison places. That means the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, will come knocking for some more dosh. That means prisons will want more money. That means MOJ want more money. And so you can see how, essentially, this massive dysfunction at the very core of government has starved policing, has starved the criminal justice system, and not least because, among other things that chiefs often say, we can't arrest our way out of the problem, right, is a common refrain you hear. And so the police have done, the police chiefs for decades now have done their own legs. The ones who stand up and go, oh no, we can't arrest our way. Oh no, stop and search doesn't work. Or oh, we're gonna move to root causes. Oh yeah, great. That sounds great on the little circuits they might be on. But what the Treasury here is, well, we don't need to give them any money. We'll give it to education. We'll give it to health. We'll give it to, I don't know, we'll give it to Timbuktu. But literally, why would I give it to the police if the police themselves are saying, arresting doesn't change anything, stop and search doesn't work, it's all a bit racist, we're all why would anyone give any money to an institutionally racist police force? And personally as well, if you're a police and crime commissioner and your chief constable declares their force institutionally racist, fire them. It's as simple as that. Fire them.
Yeah.
Because who has been leading this institution? Who has been presiding over this? And maybe before you fire them, you ask them to actually present concrete evidence, right? And then watch as they're a sort of rabbit in headlights. Then fire them. That's basically where we need to get to. Because the current chiefs, I think as a generation, I think the history books will not be kind to the current generation of chiefs. Perhaps with a few exceptions. I don't think they'll be kind. And just to bring it, Ollie, you've got me on a bit of a mini rant, but you brought it up earlier on, the new Met for London. Well, where's the progress on that? Where is the progress? We want more money. Well, what have you delivered? And just to say as well, that was a burning platform of epic proportions. The harrowing, awful, horrendous case of Sarah Everard. I mean, that was let me know if I've got it wrong, but in my mind, that is probably the darkest. It's up there, right? With it's worse than Stephen Lawrence. Stephen Lawrence wasn't actually killed by police officers, right? Like, there were lots of issues with the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, right? That quite rightly got addressed. But Sarah Everard was murdered, kidnapped, and all the rest by a serving police officer. That is, to my mind, that's the Met's darkest day. And I think for me, there's just huge disappointment at the fact that there was a burning platform there for the commissioner, a new commissioner, to come in and do some radical stuff. And I just haven't seen any of it, to be totally honest with you.
Well,
and after our experience with Operation Coffee Break, Ollie, we've not even heard. We're still waiting on a private office of getting on, what is it, £3 billion odd a year organisation. We can barely get a head and a tail out of them.
I've been very vocal over the last sort of 6 months with my concerns that if policing has no money, why are we spending fortunes wrapping cars in rainbow flags and allowing officers to partake in these, what I consider to be very politically sensitive movements, which have a lot of people having heated conversations. And whilst policing is crying for more and more money, I don't think it's being allocated. I think what this comes back to is policing priorities are so out of whack. The compass is spinning at a million miles. They're policing those that shout the loudest and call themselves victims. And policing is getting stuck in the middle of those politicised conversations, whilst also trying to meet the needs and expectations of communities on both sides. So coming back to your earlier point around two-tier policing, 12 months ago, I said to Nick Ferrari, I understand the terminology, but I don't buy into it. At the moment, no one's convincing me that it's not happening. No one's convincing me that the police aren't actually policing in completely different fashions to different groups. They are not policing consistently at all. And someone is driving that narrative, which is dreadfully frightening. And as you say quite rightly, they're building plans such as the Met's new Police for London plan. I haven't seen a skerrick of a media release or anything to show me that there's been impact over. The only thing I've heard in the last 6 months is Lynn Owens is leaving. Her job was to just get the Met out of special measures and then move on. I would have liked to have heard that she'd maybe done a little bit more in terms of that new Met for London policing plan and the results that have been achieved. We've absolutely heard nothing, and I doubt we will. And as you quite rightly say, we launch a campaign, Operation Coffee Break, to buy every armed response officer in London a coffee to say thank you and to show some admiration for a very, very difficult job. We write 3 emails to the Met, City of London and BTP.
Yeah. We
get 1 semi-acknowledgement from the City of London Police, and from everybody else, it's like tumbleweed going down the road, right. Other than a public apology because they told some porcupines in terms of our correspondence. But I'm just absolutely gobsmacked at the loss of direction in policing, and I genuinely believe they don't know which way to head.
No, I think that's fair, and I mean, obviously we could chew this to death, but
yeah,
I mean, the thing that's always struck me is, I've had the privilege of obviously being a police officer in the first place, then for my sins deciding to go back again and being fortunate again to return in, this time into Thames Valley, as a direct entry inspector. Don't hold that against me, anyone who's listening who's opposed to direct entry. But I was fortunate, I was privileged to do that. And what I found fascinating is to then find myself essentially invited to go and join the number 10 policy unit, like the heart of government, advise the Prime Minister and to try and get government to sort of do some of the right things around policing and crime. And honestly, in my time there, the representations I received from policing, from whether it's the Federation or anyone else, I mean, I could count on one hand the sort of the extent of kind of proactive engagement from them. And I think for me that's symptomatic, right? Like, it's kind of the cops themselves, the chiefs and those who have kind of lobbying or campaigning-y kind of roles, right, or advocacy kind of roles, I think they're actually just not very good at their job. I just don't think actually they're very good at knowing how the system actually works. And I think they don't actually really often know what it is they want. And I think that's the big challenge also for whoever's going to have a crack at being a future government come 2029. Obviously, Reform riding high in the polls. Tories doing terribly at the minute. Labour, well, I mean, they're probably bottom of the pack. But someone is going to win, hopefully convincingly, one would hope, the next general election with a proper manifesto, a proper plan. And I think the issue we've got is policing itself is not going to come up with, on day one of a new government of whatever colour or hue or flavour, policing itself is not going to have the plan to get policing out of the mess it's in. It's not. And so actually, who is going to come up with that plan? Well, obviously you'd hope some of the political parties might, but again, from what we know of political parties, they're very focused on sort of short-termism. They're very focused on just winning power, just winning seats, winning councils and so on. And so I think this is, where putting a plug in for the Public Safety Foundation, I think the Public Safety Foundation has a huge, and this is one of the reasons we set it up, was a huge opportunity, actually, with the right support, with the right engagement from people, real opportunity to have proper, honest conversations, come up with workable policy, put those proposals to the different political parties, get them adopted, and create a better place so that we end up with making the UK the safest place to live, work, and raise a family. So I suppose my hope, there's a lot of challenge of the last few years with policing and beyond, but my hope is that the foundation has a critical role to play. So anyone listening who thinks they have something to say, something meaningful to contribute, do get in touch with us.
I think, and just to add to that, is that, and having spoken to members of the Reform Party, the Conservative Party, having worked with yourself in your time in government, is that it's one thing to back the police, which is brilliant, but it's another thing to come up with policy and funding initiatives that ultimately make a difference. Because just backing them publicly on social media and standing up there and flying the flag and saying, we love our cops, that's great, and we'll always embrace that. But it's the funding that's the part, when you look at the population growth, when you look at the dynamics in societies, which are becoming more complex, these things need funding in order to A, understand them and B, police them. So, and policing, plays a huge part in the success and the financial success of a country. It gives people confidence to start businesses in local communities and towns. It gives tourists the confidence to come and visit your big cities and spend money. All of this, strong policing leads to a stronger economy. And I think it's really important that, that political parties and those seeking to get power, as you quite rightly say, it's one thing to get power, it's another to make a difference. So as you say, the Public Foundation, well placed to sort of come up with those strong ideas and to have those conversations, some of which will be difficult conversations, but equally able to come up with the policy ideas and the initiatives to hopefully make a difference going forward. Yeah,
absolutely. And I suppose to just bring it back full circle to Dorset and to former PC Lorne Castle, I mean, if you've not already dialed up the crowdfunder, then, if you're listening to us, watching us, whatever, do fire it up. Just take a moment to enjoy the fact that it is doing as well as it is. And if you've got a few quid, even if it's just £1 or £2, put it in. And don't feel bad if you want to dial back the tip for the admin fee or whatever, just put in as little as you feel able, really, because it obviously will mean a lot to him, it will mean a lot to his colleagues, and it will mean a lot to his family. So encourage everyone to get on that. Anything else I'm missing, Ollie? Anything else?
Well, no, the one thing I just add on that is you look at Operation Coffee Break, raised £10,700. You look at the Dorset fundraiser, as you say, a tad over 40,000. You look at the funds that were raised for the 2 TSG officers in the Met last year. That reached significant levels. I think 80 grand plus. It may even gone into six figures. that tells me that there is a hell of a lot of support for frontline cops from the British public. You know, people recognise how important policing is. They want good, strong, capable police officers in the front lines because they know what the place would look without them. So, you know, for me, it spells volumes, and you know, I wish, as we'll talk over coming episodes the challenges, but you know, I'm optimistic policing will find a better place soon.
Yeah, I think so. It has to. It has to.
Mm.
Especially if we want to achieve anything as a country that we might want to, like the economic growth that we need to put money in people's pockets. You know, as you say, it relies on public safety. And I suppose the other thing, just on the coffee break and on the crowdfunder, you know, just you know, reading some of the comments that people left. I mean, I was really struck by the comments left by people on Operation Coffee Break. You know, people like heartfelt comments from people who, you know, again, I say this, you know, some people were putting in like £2-3, right? Like literally probably wouldn't even buy a coffee in London, right? You know, from some of the chains, you'd struggle to get a coffee for that. And it felt really heartfelt, the fact that it was a small amount actually. And it felt even more so when you looked at some of the messages of people genuinely saying, I stand with you, you do a cracking job, everyone, you know, you can't win, etc., etc. And looking at some of the same comments, or similar comments, should I say, directed towards Lorne and his crowdfunder, I mean, it's all the more so. I mean, that, as you say, that outpouring of goodwill inherent to the British public for frontline crime-fighting cops who do go to work to do the good job each day. I mean, it's there. It feels more resilient, honestly, than I thought it was. You know, you'll recall Coffee Break launched, and I think I think literally the next day or the day of the launch, you know, there was that whole debacle in Hertfordshire, I think, where, you know, the parents got arrested for having criticised the school and all, you know, all of that. And you know what, I thought, God, that's going to absolutely knacker this initiative, and yet actually the public pulled through. So I think the resilience is there for a lot of the frontline cops. I think the issue is the chiefs have just lost not all of them, but a lot of them have just completely lost the plot and lost the public with it. So if you want to join our mission, do visit our website. Do smash all the relevant buttons in and around this: the like, the share, the retweet, the this, that, and the other. Smash all of those. Lots more of these short-ish little updates and episodes to come. It doesn't leave much more for me to say other than thanks so much, Ollie, for doing all you've done for the foundation in recent months, really.
No, it's a pleasure. You know, like it's a big part of my life as it is for yours. You know, policing, I think, is always ingrained in you somewhere, and I think it's if not us, who else really to speak up for these issues? Because if I'm honest with you, when I look across the public domain across the UK, I don't see people having the same level of conversations that you and I regularly publicly have, not only backing frontline cops, but equally being the critical friend to policing, because it doesn't always get things right, and we call it out when it's wrong, and there's been some craziness going on. But equally, it needs strong supporters. So we stand at its corner with the many thousands of people that have kindly donated, as you say, to Operation Coffee Break, and not just writing one or two words of kind regards, you know, decent sentences where people have sat down and thought about what it means and the challenges people are facing. So just echoing your sentiments of a huge thank you to everybody. And yeah, we'll keep having these regular conversations and sort of challenging the narrative and hopefully move things forward.
Amen, brother, as they would say.
Hallelujah. Right, nice, mate.
See you soon.